קהילה מדומיינת באמצעות עיתון, אבל אפשר גם קהילה מדומיינת אולי באמצעות ראיון. אנחנו תכף אולי נבדוק את זה, אם באמת יש הקשרים. אז הדובר הבא שלנו הוא דניאל מאלה, שהוא is a senior lecturer in Jewish history at the University of Haifa. He is part of the university's Yקים initiative, archive and museum for the history and heritage of German-speaking Jewry in Israel. In this context, he works on the oral testimonies of second and third generation Yekes. Before joining Haifa University, he was an assistant professor, wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter, at the history department of Ludwig Maximilian University Munich, as well as the coordinator of the LMU's Center for Israeli Studies. His book, Orthodox Judaism and the Politics of Religion from Pre-War Europe to State of Israel, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, and the title of his talk today, Reclaiming Agency Through Conversation, Life Narratives, Interviews of German-Speaking Jews in Israel. Daniel, the floor is yours.
תודה רבה שרון, אני מתנצל על האנגלית, אבל כמו ששמענו לא קל לעולים חדשים מגרמניה לדבר בעברית. Okay. Palestine, or later Israel, is the country that welcomed us, that saved us. I'm grateful for that, but what I will always miss in the land of milk and honey are the white and purple lilacs and chestnut avenues. This quote comes from Carrie Klötzl. Born in Berlin in 1919, Klötzl grew up in the Weimar Republic and witnessed the rise of National Socialism. Her family managed to escape to Palestine in the 1930s, and Klötzl built up a new life here in Palestine, later Israel, for herself and had family. But she could not erase, or did not want to erase, completely her background. Her ties to German culture remained part of her identity, and this is expressed right in this dichotomy that she expresses here. Klötzl is one of 16 Yekes interviewed by journalist Andrea von Treuenfeld in 2009 and published as a book 2 years later. This is among many similar works that have been published in the last, let's say, 20 years by mostly lay historians, many Germans, some Israeli Americans, but a lot of Germans who did that. And for me as a historian, it's interesting because it's a very important collections, but it's always the question, how can we deal with these sources that others, oral history has a long history of debate, how to deal with oral history testimonies, but it becomes more complicated when you didn't do the interview yourself, because you weren't there, you don't know much about the interaction that was there. So all I have is a printed book, and what do I do with it as a historian? And in this short talk, I want to think about this, and take von Treuenfeld's book as a case study. Previous research on Yekes oral history has, focused on gender, for example, and we'll have a great, I'm sure, a very good lecture later in the afternoon by Viola Rautenberg, and on the Zionist touch of these interviews, as well as their clinging to German culture. I want to propose here a different reading. I want to propose to read them as sort of a trialogue. Meaning a dialogue of the Yekes between both German society and Israeli society. Through this trialogue, the respondents negotiate their affiliations and loyalties between Israel and Germany, between Israeliness and Germanness. So, and to do that, I will shortly talk on Treuenfeld's book, and then look at these two dialogues and then draw some conclusions. So why, out of the wealth of these books, do I focus on von Treuenfeld's book? She's a non-Jewish German who came to Israel as a volunteer in the 70s and became fascinated by the Yekes. In the early 2000s, she interviewed these 16 women. These 16 women come from different places in Germany and settled in different places in Palestine, Israel. They come from different social backgrounds, but they all grew up in the Weimar Republic, witnessed National Socialism, and then came to Palestine. So they all are part of what we call a social generation who witnessed the same experiences and thus is shaped by similar things. The great advantage of her book is that she did not try to steer these conversations. She merely asked them to tell their life stories, and she let them tell their life stories. And she also did try to not edit too much afterwards. I had a long conversation with her on that. So that allows us to draw a conclusion on the Yekis' self-depiction in these interviews, of how they depict themselves and their lives and their families. In this regard, it's striking indeed that all these interviews are structured in a very similar way. They all begin with the childhood in the Weimar Republic, then turn to anti-Semitism and expulsion from Nazi Germany, how they built up their lives in Palestine and in Israel. And in the last section, they all come to talk about their attitudes towards German culture, Germany, current days. Despite these drastic, so the main plot structuring this narrative is obviously, the rupture that these women went through. But despite all this upheaval, they come to a positive conclusion. They have a progressive narrative of their lives. They succeeded to overcome these obstacles. Von Treuenfeld found these respondents by ads and similar means. She did not know them beforehand. The interviews were conducted in German, and it was clear from the beginning that it is for a German public. So consequently, the respondents saw von Treuenfeld as a representative of the broader German public. Against this background, the interviews can be seen as part of a broader German-Jewish dialogue. The German-Jewish dialogue that I'm talking about comes up especially in the last section, in which the Yekis discuss their relationship to today's Germany. All of these women are still attached to German culture and language in some way. All of them have returned to the country of their birth, and most of them had reservations in the beginning, but then overcame them. Some stayed resentful and did not build up a positive association with this country. But in most cases, it's clear that the encounter with Germany and Germans played a very strong part in their coming to terms with their past. The conversation with von Treuenfeld can be seen in this context. Most of the women explicitly tell her that they do not see themselves as Germans and cannot imagine going back, immigrating to Germany. Here's a quote: "I would certainly have stayed in Germany if Hitler had not existed," says Herta Protter, "but to live in Germany today, no." Now, in this context, the question arises as to what triggered these exclamations. Why are they telling her this? She did not ask the question. Indeed, in an Israeli conversation, it would probably not have come up. Why would you want to leave, right? And indeed, if you look at other collections by American and Israeli scholars, it's much less frequent there. They talk sometimes about it. I would suggest that this can be seen as this part of German-Jewish dialogue. They see her as a representative, and they had probably encounters before where Germans asked them, are you coming back? And indeed, one woman hints at tells an anecdote where a mayor of her old city of birth asked this question, and she was very insistent on nobody's coming back, right? So you have this dialogue here. Another issue that keeps coming up is the mention of the German version of the television show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? By the very famous, in Germany, very famous entertainer Günther Jauch. The show was so popular among Yekis that von Treuenfeld even asked the entertainer to write a short foreword for this book. Most Israelis would probably not recognize Günther Jauch, and again, the topic would probably not have come up as frequently as it did. Against this backdrop, it's interesting to note the different ways in which these individuals talk about Jauch and what it means to them. Hilde Hoffmann, for example, admits that she mentions that she watches it and admits that there's a similar Israeli version, but she much rather looks at this because she can answer many more of the questions than in the Israeli version, even though she has lived in Israel for many decades. Hoffman attributes this to the fact that she went to school in Germany and now comes the quote, also to the fact that my parents were completely German. It was not just the language, it was the culture, it was everything. I went to the opera for the first time when I was 9. Another motivation for watching Jauch is expressed by Shoshana Friedlander, whose family lived in the small town of Witzenhausen for 400 years before the Nazis drove them out. In her interview, she voices a deep resentment towards Germany, and it is puzzled by the fact that many Israeli Jews consider living there. I understand if you don't want to live in Israel, she says. It's difficult and sometimes not moral. Go to Honolulu, but not to Germany. But then she admits that she watches Jauch, and she says, to explain, I watch it because I want to prove to myself how much I know about Günther Jauch's, what he asks. And that's a lot. Then I don't understand why the Germans sitting there don't know. It's elementary knowledge. We may be farmers, but we speak 3 languages, and we read and listen in 3 languages. So part of the thrill for her seems to be proving herself that she's better than these Germans. In this way, Jauch and his show symbolize the Yekis' multifaceted reckoning with their German roots, and similar to the question of remigration, is part of this dialogue. But at the same time, these Yekis are in dialogue with the Israeli environments. When interviewed, all the Yekis have been living in Israel for many decades, and accordingly recalled their life story in this context. This is expressed in many statements in which the women, for example, compare current Israel to the time when they came here, right? Mostly, obviously, negative today. Chaya Florentin says, today everyone is materially oriented. In the past, there was nothing like that there. We did not eat caviar, but we did not starve. And we had joy in our hearts, which is the most important thing, and help from everyone. Anyone who could help, helped. Another aspect of this is that the Yekis' recollections of the past draw on and respond to public debates that have been held in Israel. By way of example, many of these accounts talk about, when they talk about their life in Nazi Germany, they mention little acts of defiance of Nazi orders. For example, going to a coffee shop when it was clearly not allowed for them to be there, or going to the cinema, which had a big sign, no Jews allowed, or not unwanted. Now, these anecdotes can be read as response to later Israeli debates in which German Jews were accused of failing to grasp the true nature of the Nazi regime and passively accepting their tormentous degree rather than emigrating as soon as possible. So it's a kind of a resistance, right, that they show. We can assume that they have told many of their stories before, perhaps to their children and grandchildren. The narratives shared by these encounters, their narratives were shaped by these encounters as well. So they talk about their offspring. They mention sons and daughters oftentimes when they talk about their visits to post-war Germany and the place of their childhood. Esther Golan, for example, describes a visit to her hometown of Glogau, present-day Poland, in '89. Before, she comments, I always had the feeling that the donkey had lost me in the gallop, but now my son knows where I'm come from. That helped me a lot because now we understand that now he understood what was bothering me. Growing up an orphan and always having a life to live my life alone. For Golan, the trip closed a circle. Her son, by seeing with his own eyes the places where she'd grown up, could now better understand his mother. In this way, the joint visits gave the women the chance to better explain to their families their own background and helped to bridge the rupture in their lives and between the generations. For many, their offspring symbolizes continuity and reaffirms their Israeliness. Hilde Hoffmann states, my home is here today. I'm an absolute Israeli with German roots. If I had children here and the children have been in the military and the grandchildren are in the military today, if I have gone through enough in this country, then I feel at home here today. And by the way, the German reads just as awkwardly, which kind of goes to show that really von Frauenfeld did not edit too much or tried to stay true to it. So Hoffmann came to the country as a refugee and not for ideological reasons. The statement highlights, nevertheless, her perception that since she has earned her rightful place in Israeli society, her emphasis here on the military service of her offspring places her in a specifically Israeli discourse. I don't think many Germans would see military service as a requirement for good citizenship these days, right? So in this sense, then the Yekis find themselves in a dialogue with Israeli society, which shapes their narrative in multiple ways. To conclude, In my paper, I've offered a reading of von Treuenfeld's interview as a trialogue. This argument builds on the work of oral historians who have stressed the role of the interviewers and their influences in the creative process of generating these testimonies. Much of the dynamic here, excuse me, much of the dynamics of the interview, these historians tell us, depends on not only on the respondent, but on the interviewer itself and their relationship, which in the case of von Treuenfeld, her German origins had an effect on the answers she produced. Alongside that, the Yekis also stood in long dialogue with the Israeli environments, and this shaped this conversation. All the women wrestle in one way or another with their affiliations and loyalties between Germany and Israel, between Germanness and Israeliness. Such loyalties, as the interviews make clear, are not fixed and unchanging, but in constant flux. They are influenced and transformed by their Israeli environment as well as by the encounters with post-war Germany and Germans. This trialogue, then, present in these interviews, uncovers the way in which individuals negotiate their identification between different influences. The interviews allow these women to stress or emphasize their Israeliness and distance themselves from parts of their Germanness, while at the same time pointing to their cultural affiliations as Yekis. The title of von Treuenfeld's book, In Germany a Jewess, in Israel a Yekit, draws attention to the fact that to the fixed identities these women have been assigned, first in Germany and then in Israel. In Germany they were Jewish, and in Israel they become a Yekit from the outside, right? Through their life narratives, however, these women can negotiate the balance between these different affiliations and reclaim their agency as historical subjects. Thank you very much.